to the 706 podcast, where we take a look at a movie and decide whether it is one of the 706 greatest movies of all time. My name's Connor. I'm here with my three co-hosts, my three fellow movie fiends. Could you guys please introduce yourself? Let's start with Tony.
Guys, I'm Tony, and I am a level 13 sorcerer.
Yes, you can also use your Spanish language last name, code name, in keeping with the film that we watched for this week. How about Anthony?
Anthony.
And Kirk.
Yeah, hey guys, this is Kirk Rodriguez, and I just want to say that Tony got that level 13 just for redeeming his pre-order code from GameStop, so it doesn't really mean much.
But okay, we're talking about Sorcerer, William Friedkin's 1977 suspense thriller, chiller, spiller, etc. And this is a film that I wanted to watch with you guys. I watched it not very long ago at all, and I'd heard about it as a cult film, or I was introduced to it as a kind of a cult film, little known, from this director who I know much better for The Exorcist. But this was talked about as a kind of passion project of his, something that he wished more people had seen, and that was completely overshadowed by Star Wars, which was released, I think, if not the same weekend, the same week as Sorcerer in 1977. And it was a major flop at the box office. And there was all these, as you can imagine, sort of in the milieu of the time, right? The name Sorcerer conjured up the idea of, well, a sorcerer, this is kind of an age of increasing kind of fantasy epics. Certainly Star Wars was part of that trend and was an early example of that. I think a lot of people were let down when they went to the theater and they found this, which itself, right, is a remake of a classic film, The Wages of Fear, from 1954, I believe, itself an adaptation of the Georges Arnaud novel. I don't want to get too much into the comparison of the film, of which this is more or less a remake. There are some distinct differences. Let's not talk too much about The Wages of Fear, which sadly I have not seen. I am very curious about, but I know a little bit about it and how it compares to this film. But guys, let's get into first impressions. And I'd like to turn it over to Tony, because I pitched this movie under the sort of assumption that this would be a Tony movie. I thought it had all the kind of hallmarks of a Tony movie, the kind of suspense, this sort of quality of doom and gloom, of consequences, and a certain kind of grittiness that I thought Tony would respond to. But let's see what he made of it. Tony, yes. Please.
Connor, for those of you who didn't listen to the previously on the 706 segment with all our cliffhangers from last week, Connor said to me in so many words, Tony, I promise you, this will be your new favorite movie. If it is not your favorite movie of all time, not only can you vote no, you can never pick one of my movies again. And I'm like, he was really throwing down the gauntlet. Luckily for him, no. This movie, I totally see why he said that and why he pitched it so hard for me, because this does have like I think a Tony aesthetic and a Tony sensibility, in that it like sort of the grittiness, yes, the actions having consequences, the savagery of it, the lack of sentimentality, sort of the just matter of fact destruction of human bodies and explosions, captured in a very realistic, remarkably, I guess, just realistic way. Also that 70s grit, these rugged characters, sort of it's a bunch of men, a bunch of sweaty men doing a job and getting killed, which is definitely like a good genre. It's like a genre that I hold dear. I'll say this is a movie that it didn't quite go all the way with me. Like, it didn't blow my mind and like make me think, oh my God, I love it so much immediately. But some of my favorite movies, I need a second viewing to get, because the first time I watched Boogie Nights, I had kind of a similar reaction where it had a lot of ingredients that I really liked. Like, this to me is like you're making a sandwich and you start off with a nice ciabatta, you get like a homemade mayo, a homemade saffron aioli, you get some sun-dried tomatoes, some arugula, you get some buffalo mozzarella, some prosciutto di Parma, you get all the right ingredients, take a bite, and I'm like, it's a pretty good sandwich. That's kind of how this felt to me. But I can see on a second viewing some of the elements that didn't quite translate to me. kind of making more sense, because there were things in this movie. There was nothing in this movie that I overtly disliked, but there were things that I was slightly confused by, or that didn't quite hit me, I think, in the way that they were supposed to. But there were also things in the movie that were truly great and truly mind-blowing and truly justify the movie's cult status, to my mind. The one thing that I was most taken aback by, based on what I've heard about this movie, and how I'd heard it described, because I'd heard the premise, of course. You have two trucks loaded with dynamite racing to a destination, and if they face the slightest jolt, they'll blow up, right? So it's this really tense crackerjack premise for a film. But this sorcery does not occur until slightly over halfway through the movie. So I was very surprised that the first hour plus of the movie is all set up for this, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just I sort of wasn't prepared for that. And the movie starts off with this very interesting, like, kind of globe trotting. It almost feels like a spy movie or something, or this international conspiracy, because you're seeing these criminal acts happening all over the world. And you're like, okay, how is this all going to fit together? And they don't exactly. They're just kind of providing backstories for these characters who we actually put in these trucks. So we build up investment. And so we understand the stakes of what's happening, which I think was not a bad choice, but it was just sort of like, the movie kind of takes you for a real ride. It takes you to a lot of different places and kind of plays with your sense of expectations in a way that shows a lot of confidence. But I think what also is part of the reason this movie was not initially a financial success, because I think it trusts the viewer to be patient, and it trusts the viewer to, like, the viewer's intelligence, that they're going to be able to kind of keep up with these relationships and where everything is going. However, this movie does bring the ownage. It does bring the fire. This is the most hardcore PG movie I've ever seen in my life. And I know this is prior to PG-13, but even so, limbs blowing up, charred bodies, just the most insane acts of horrible violence. And I could go on for a while, but I'll try to keep it short here. The things that I was most impressed by were the amazing production design and the amazing mise-en-scène in every single scene, of just the sense of how grimy and how dirty and how full of life every scene was. Scenes with, like, teeming mobs yelling, and, like, there's the real sense of, like, instability. I feel like you're watching something that's about to explode, not just the truck, but these scenes in this village where the people are rioting, or they're yelling, or there's violence going on. It feels like you're watching real violence. It feels like you're watching real unrest, and just, like, the use of the extras, the use of the production design, everything, like, it's incredible. And then the actual truck, the actual kind of the money material of the movie in that second half with the truck, remarkable filmmaking. The scene in the bridge, which I think is on the poster, is one of the best, like, set pieces I've seen in the movie. One of the most, like, amazing, just tense sequences of. There are things in this movie that I don't even know how they filmed. That, like, blow my mind to imagine there were real people actually doing this stuff. And that's just my bread and butter. Also, want to give props to the editing. This is one of the best edited movies I've ever seen. And just, there's so many great cuts. And my personal favorite cut in the movie is very early. You cut from the shot of a car where a man has blown his brains out, which happens in the first, like, 15 minutes of the movie, to our protagonist, maybe not the protagonist, but on this moment, the character we're following, his wife, just peacefully eating lunch in a nice French restaurant, which I thought was great. And this movie's full of cuts like that. So that was very scattered, but in general, feel very positive, but didn't quite live up to Connor's billing as the best movie ever made of all time, but it could in the future.
No, thank you, Tony. And, when I did pitch it, I didn't quite, but I really did insist that it was definitely a Tony movie, and I was hoping he'd respond to it in a very visceral way. This would become one of his classics, one of his canon. I think he was a little lukewarm at the beginning, but I see that he reacted to certain things and certain moments that I knew he would react to in the way that I had hoped. So I'm satisfied with the dish that I prepared for him. We'll see how it all comes together at the end with the voting and whatnot, but to Tony's point about the slowness of it, yeah, it is slow. And, you have to think about it. Suspense picture, right? Obviously, right? I think it benefits from delaying the actual scene with the trucks until so late and establishing the stakes of all of the characters. But I agree, it can be surprising, even for me too. It is really about the halfway mark. I had forgotten. I watched it not too long ago, but I was surprised too, watching it again, how late they get into that. But I do love all of the building of the trucks, the driving training sequence. Anyway, we can get into these things later, but I want to hear what Kirk thought about all of this.
I just want to thank Tony for selfishly choosing a movie that would alienate the rest of us. And no, I'm just kidding. I feel like Anthony and I are going to be a little less sizzling hot with regards to our affinity for this film. It was fine. It was a fine film. You know, word that comes to mind, regrettably, is forgettable. Okay, like it's hard because for this podcast, we have to kind of straddle this fence where on one end it's like, is this film well made? And on the other hand, is this film personally compelling to me? So we have to bridge what is like, I guess there's this vain hope that we can find some objectivity, but at the same time, really kind of leaning into our own subjective experience of a film. And for me, I kind of like oscillate back and forth and try to find a happy medium. And this film, I think along with Tony, I think there are some absolutely incredible set pieces. I mean, this film must have cost a lot of money. There are very few things I can point to where I can say, oh yeah, this film is 43 years old. Yeah, 43. I mean, you know, you can tell it's a little dated, but you know, as far as the effects go, as far as the set pieces are concerned, you know, the bridge scene, it's absolutely stunning. I was wondering if they were using miniatures or what they were doing. Like, if you compare this to Star Wars, I guess a true contemporary, right? It's not even close. Like, you know, Star Wars was hailed as this kind of amazing leap forward for, special effects. And this film did some things in an incredible way that I can't even imagine how they accomplished. Like, the explosions all felt real. Even the explosion at the beginning in Jerusalem, like, it looked real. Like, there weren't any really quick cuts, right? You know, to like some soundstage. The squibs, you know, the blood throughout the film was, you know, looked a little bit like tomato juice, but that's okay. That might have been the one dated aspect for me, but kind of like the mechanics of the film were great. I think, right, you run into some issues for me, which generally fall along the lines of pacing. I think this film, you know, if you know what the general plot of the film is, the conceit of the film is before going in, then perhaps the suspense is kind of this augmenting factor, right? But if you didn't, like, imagine just going into this film not knowing anything about it, and you're like, what the fuck is going on right now? Like, I get there's these 4 outcasts that are in some South American country. I'm not sure I'm not good with flags. They never explicitly said the country, or is it a fictionalized like republic?
Nicaragua, pretty much, but
okay,
they never
Central
say
America,
as much.
Central America. Okay, so yeah, it's like, what's going on here? What, you know, how are these characters tied together? Like, in the beginning, I love films that kind of, you know, you have to put your trust in them, and you kind of get the slow burn, right? And I found my faith wavering a little bit, almost on the edge of zoning out. But I stuck with it, and I think once they get to the hut with the dynamite in it, I think that's when the film truly kind of gets on track. Everything else before, it's a little dispersed and kind of hard to grasp. But I think there's also a problem with just the general idea of the film, which on paper sounds good. You know, it's kind of like a lot of Fallout quests, which, you know, they sound good as one-liners, but then you kind of turn them into real things, and you're like, okay, how does this work? Because if this is going to explode with any sort, you know, like, this film, obviously, I'm being, you know, facile when I say that this film is not realistic, but even based on the rules that they presented to us, it breaks its own rules. I mean, there's absolutely no way they would have gone 5 feet without the crates exploding. If they couldn't survive a helicopter having, you know, hanging the explosives, how did they survive this trip through the jungle? And so it's hard for me, because it's like, okay, I'm sitting here watching, and I'm like, when is the director going to decide that one of these trucks needs to blow up? And so I'm not really I feel like there's an element of kind of like an arbitrary element to it, where we're subject to the discretion of the creators of the film. And that's okay. I mean, obviously that's every film. And also there's kind of a general problem with when you're watching for something to not happen, that's a tricky thing. Like, we're watching for these trucks to not explode when usually in film we're looking for things to happen. And so it's hard to create and sustain suspense because it requires so much investment on our part to constantly remind ourselves that these trucks are filled with explosives. And maybe that's a fault of my own, right? Like, maybe I really couldn't dive in and be an attentive, obedient viewer. And, I know I'm trending negative right now. I think this film was really good. I think, and that's funny for me, I know, after all I said, I think this film was good for what it was, right? This is a very good film for what it was. Not every film has to be The Godfather or Citizen Kane. I think my problems were pacing, lack of dialogue, which I know was kind of like intentional, but you have such a perfect opportunity with these two pairs sitting in cars to discuss how they got into these predicaments, right? Like, what's going on. The idea of the fourth person being some sort of hitman was never really fully fleshed out, who he was after. I felt like they left some loose ends, untied. Yeah, I felt like it needed a second cut. So I'm going to disagree with Tony when he says the editing. I mean, it was flashy, but I really think it suffered from poor pacing. And having said all that, I think it's a great film for what it is. Like, I really do. So I don't know if that makes any sense. You can understand anything, I guess. From my perspective, it would be that this film really doesn't care what you think in a way, and it does it so well. It makes you understand that it doesn't care to such a great extent that you have to respect it. That's what I'll say.
Kirk, did you ever see the Key and Peele parody of Hell's Kitchen, where the host of the cooking show says, "This is the worst thing I've ever tasted, but that's why it's great. You're great at cooking bad food." And it just goes back. That's what it feels like sometimes when you're talking about a movie.
Well, I kind of, it's like stream of consciousness. I think generally it's more fun to kind of poke holes in movies than to, kind of lap on the praise. I guess for me, I have a low threshold for annoyance. And so when I get annoyed by a film, I feel like it's extra irksome for me. So there were some annoyances with this film, but that shouldn't take away at the end of the day from the overall picture, which, looking, years ahead, when I look back on Sorcerer, I'll probably mostly think positively about it. But in the moment right now, I'm a little bit irked by some of its flaws, and using that critical eye to see those flaws. But I enjoyed the experience, Connor, and I think it was a good choice. I really do. So.
Sure, Kirk, thank you. I think what you're saying, well made, not great. I think maybe I heard a little bit of that in Tony too. And I'm sympathetic to that view. I think it does have qualities that elevate it a bit, but I think what I admire it most is kind of its contentedness just to be itself and to be the suspense movie with this unique kind of tone, and just on a subjective level, Kirk, to think about how our experiences of the movie differ. I think, you're right. There is something about, yes, we're just waiting for this bomb to go off. The director knows, when the bombs go off. That's a very tricky thing, right? The writer and director of the movie, or the teller of the story, can make the bomb go off whenever he or she wants, right? And there's nothing we can do about it. And essentially we're trying to get into their head, right? And at that point, the movie fails, or the story fails, because if we're just thinking about when are they going to tell me, right, when this is going to happen, when are they going to make the bomb go off, right, then something is definitely lost. And I think that's a problem that the movie has. I think it manages to escape this, I think, partially by the fact of having two trucks. Otherwise, you think somehow it cannot blow up, or it has to blow up in a situation where they're all out of the car, right? At least they have the two trucks, so one of them can blow up, maybe both can blow up. I think it's, in terms of premise, it's kind of saved by that. And also, I think, one thing you did not mention, and what I think is a big part of the suspense, is not just waiting for the trucks to blow up or reminding ourselves that there's dynamite in the trucks, but rather that we see our characters emote in response to this threat, right? And I think of the example of Kassem, played by Amidou, who's driving the truck. It's one of the first kind of stunts in the movie where the truck's wheel breaks through a bridge or a platform, and we see him basically convinced that he's about to die, right? That we see a moment of him getting ready to be dead. That kind of thing is what I think kind of makes the movie for me. It's not so much like, oh, like I like seeing their reaction to this dangerous situation, not that I'm worried the bomb's going to go off. I would say that would be the distinction I would make in how I approach the movie, and why I think I can avoid some of the dissonance and that problem that you describe, right? But thank you, Kirk, for that opinion, nuanced opinion. And let's hear from Anthony last.
Sure. So very interesting criticism about the waiting for things not to happen. I like the way that was put, Kirk, and I like the way Connor sort of summarized it and added a sort of dimension to it. That was not something I had thought about during the movie, and not something I necessarily gravitated towards as a criticism, though I could understand it. So in terms of the movie, I described last week that I had never seen this movie, and I'd heard about it in the way that Tony had, which is that it's a movie about the delivery of something explosive in a sort of nebulous, ambiguous Latin American country. And similarly, I was very surprised at when we finally got to that sort of storyline in the time frame of the movie. But what I have heard about the movie is, of course, something that Connor alluded to, which is that it's a movie that essentially becomes one of the markers for the end of the 70s. It's a kind of box office disaster, parallel to Star Wars success, kind of ushers in the end of the sort of movie brats of the 70s type thing, which is always kind of stuck around with the film. It's always been kind of fascinating to me. And to some extent, honestly, it's more fascinating to me than various parts of the movie. But when watching the movie, as I started it, it's a very interesting opening that we've all commented upon. It reminds me actually a lot of the things that Inarritu starts off with, like in Ameros Peros or even in Babel. Of course, Inarritu is more interested in seeing how those interactions connect in a sort of network around the globe, a sort of globalization narrative, which this one, of course, wants to pull back and wants to show us a global event and pulled back to a very specific place where people are actually brought together, as opposed to the influence of things across the globe, I think. That's just one interesting connection. In terms of the film itself, I thought of a lot of similarity to actually Herzog. I kept thinking about Fitzcarraldo and Aguirre Wrath of God, and the sort of details of the grimy Latin America to the lush green that's all around him at all times, and this rain that just seems to fall completely to make all this vegetation possible, which is super kind of interesting of a design choice. And I don't know if it's because Herzog was in my head, but it really helped usher in the madness, I think, of the sort of delivery and the sort of impossibility at the same time that seems to be going on. So that's all there. But with all that being said, I think I was somewhat a little bit more positive than Kirk's initial impression that he first stated, which was like, I think it's a fine movie. I wasn't sold by it. I'm not convinced that this is like a lost masterpiece or even a lost great film of the 70s, to be honest. I think it's a pretty fine one. It's a decent one, maybe good. I think for me, as I watch it and I see this journey, is the delivery is honestly the least interesting part of the movie to me. I'm more fascinated by the interrelations that are happening in the sort of oil industry across the town to this Hacia Unidos al Futuro, this sort of building project that's so interesting. And honestly, the most fascinating part of the movie is towards the end, when he finally drops off the sort of explosives, which could end the fire. And there's just this wondrous image that's like pointed from the top, and we see Roy Schneider's like small silhouette approaching the fire and collapse, and that ongoing fire that needs to be stopped. That, to me, is the more interesting film. But with all that being said, at the same time, I wonder, honestly, for me personally, I'm not saying anyone else should do this. This is a film I think I would have enjoyed more if I watched it in segments, because there's a Saturday morning serial-like quality to the storytelling, which starts off with this kind of grand spy event, as Tony said, goes into this kind of adventurous town. And then we have another segment with the kind of Saturday morning cartoon feel, which is like the delivery of the impossible object. And then kind of the standard 70s end, which is like the bleak, cynical ending. And I think personally, if I watched it segmented, I would have been able to appreciate the moments that you will probably see, Connor, and that Tony kind of pinpointed out. But that's just me. So as an overall thing, I thought it was fine. Didn't sell me. I could see the Tony love, and if we had seen this movie in college, I would have thought this is an instant Tony film. So that's it for now.
Thank you, Anthony, for your thoughts there. I have to think more about the episodic nature of it, because I feel, I would say, the whole thing might feel like an episode of a show almost, like I think it is such a kind of tight premise, I would think, but interesting, the idea of breaking it up and how you would split it up, or maybe we could expand on the backstories of the characters. But I do have to say, I like the way it is. And if I could remark just a little bit on, why I like this long opening, I think there's so many things, and I think they're mostly down to kind of these action moments. Again, like, the building of the trucks, where there's so much, gritty detail in the oil coming out of the trucks and taking them apart, and the light and all these things, and this kind of noir lighting throughout, that gives this kind of gritty reality and this kind of lush feeling of the jungle and of the town. And I think that's, kind of the note of realism, which is so helped. And I think, as Anthony mentioned, this idea of this being kind of the last of the 70s films. And I guess my kind of historical spin I'll put on it is this, that it certainly belongs to, and I think Anthony basically already pointed to this, that it feels like, right, like a new Hollywood movie, in that, right, it has there's this kind of anti-heroic element, right, sort of morally ambiguous, with an unhappy ending, with violence, and certainly this machismo, this grittiness, this ugliness of the world. It's definitely part of it. I think this movie harnesses it and kind of presses it into a kind of tightly wound machine. I think it masters these things. And also, for instance, it uses some qualities of that style of film from New Hollywood, like, for instance, handheld camera. We've talked about, I basically mentioned this for every 70s movie we watch. It's getting a little bit old at this point to point this out, but yes, the use of handheld, which here, right, is often used for like frenetic moments of action, for a sense of chaos, of disorientation. Here it's used a lot, sometimes for those reasons, but often more for some of these, especially these early scenes where we're seeing scenes from around the world. We have a lot of handheld shots that, of course, evoke documentary footage, right? As if we're watching a television program about a far off land, right? The sense of the reality of these events, as if we're kind of a fly on the wall. So I think Friedkin is kind of using the techniques, but sort of in a more mature way than some of his predecessors. And I think it's interesting that it sort of anticipates, kind of the cinema of the 80s. And I think in general, the way in which it does is the sort of the simplicity of this plot, the kind of the purity of this plot. But I think, as Anthony points out, right, the kind of new Hollywoodness of it is this kind of dark tone and this, bleak ending. But what else to say? I mean, I think my favorite, I think the moment of the introductions that really, for me encapsulates it, is the idea of Victor Mazon, who, the French guy, right, who is himself a banker, right? And notice just in that first scene where he's talking to his wife about a nonfiction book that she's writing about a French foreign legionnaire, right? This man who says that he had the power, right, to kill people with kind of just a wave of his hand. And he wonders to himself, right, what hand will gesture such that I will be killed, essentially, right? And that's, I think, strikes the note of the film, this kind of existential dread of being destroyed, which is brought on by guilt about, basically doing this to others. Now we have the other characters. We have Kassem, we have Roy Scheider's character, right? We have these characters who are killers, right? All of them are killers. They've either killed using bombs or guns, or they've killed in some way. Our banker character, Victor, who's a kind of a fraudulent banker, right, who's the hammer's about to come down to him. We understand that he kills and he has power in a different way, right? He has economic power, and this is certainly alluded to, right? And we see the same thing, right, in the case of the oil company, at whose whim basically all of these men are once they all go on the run. But I love this moment with Victor, the French guy, where he's basically been informed that he's going to be taken in on charges of fraud. He's desperately trying to get his brother-in-law to call his dad. Like multiple times he asked him, like, call your dad, get him to bail us out of the situation. He's like, he says we can't. He says we can't. So he's out to lunch with his wife, right? And then he asks his brother-in-law one more time. The brother-in-law immediately goes to the car and kills himself. Then Victor simply just runs away. He leaves his wife at the dinner table and just runs away. I think there's something so pure. The sense of dread, the sense of just pure destruction raining down, literally running away from your life and your problems, getting as far away as you possibly can, right? Essentially, right, for having done these things or for having committed these acts that you know are wrong, right, you're essentially dead. And this place in Nicaragua, it's a sort of hell, right, where they're being punished for their misdeeds, right? It's a sort of purgatory of some kind, right? They themselves are at the mercy of this completely immoral, itself highly morally suspect, right, oil company that itself is going to face its own doom. It's implied based on, right, the kind of rebels who are hiding out, right? So everyone has this kind of overwhelming sense of doom. And of course, the car loaded with dynamite becomes a kind of, visual metaphor for this feeling. And of course, I think the fun of watching these characters emote, all trapped in their own private worlds, freaking out about, the impending end of their lives. That's to me the sort of the flavor of the movie, the thing that really carries it forward and that elevates this simple kind of action-y premise and elevates it. And I think, again, a thing that sort of encapsulates this, right, is the ending where Roy Scheider's character, being the last man standing, he carries the box of dynamite 2 miles, winds up right at the oil well to blow it up, is a hero now and is given citizenship by the oil company, which itself is kind of, getting nervous. There's the sense of that the oil company itself is going to be pushed out of the region. And at this moment, he decides to dance with this woman who we've seen earlier, this kind of washerwoman in the bar, who's this old lady. And again, that moment of just simply, I think his own sense of impending doom is coming upon him. And to me, I think it's just having one last thing in his life. He can't make it to Managua. He's not going to get to the big city and live it up. He's never going to go back to the US. He knows this is kind of it for him. He wants to be able to live life the way he never did, right? He spent most of his life killing, right? He wants this kind of final moment of living his life, of not running away from the dinner table, so to speak, just living his life before he lets the doom, come to him, right? He's not running away anymore. That's kind of my reading of that last moment. Of course, then inexplicably, these kind of New Jersey gangsters kind of incongruously show up in the Nicaraguan town. I do find it a little bit much. But that's a minor flaw to what I think is like a very moving and, to me, kind of viscerally interesting sort of final note of the movie. And kind of thematically, I think it's very compelling. But anyway, I was just throwing the book at you guys, but I'm curious if you have any more thoughts about the film. Let's not go too long, as we're rather late on this episode, but I'm curious if anyone has any other thoughts.
Well, Connor, I love that. I loved your reading of the movie, and I think you're making more of these things click in a way that I was kind of talking about, where I said on the second viewing, I could see myself really taking this to the next level. But you're making me want to watch it again and opening certain things up. But I think that what I love about the ending, and as you're right, there is something kind of far-fetched about these guys showing up, but I almost like that about it, in that it sort of feels there's almost something supernatural about it, or almost like the God intervening at this moment, because it's like he can't win. Like he fundamentally, the sense of the doom is his fate, and it's like he has cheated fate by making it with the dynamite and accomplishing his goal. Like he was supposed to die, he was supposed to get blown up. So because he succeeded, these guys are like spawning in. Kirk is like rolling his eyes at me. No, I think this is true. I think this is thematically.
Is this the pitch meeting for Final Destination? Is this what we're doing right now?
No, I think I like that sense of doom. I think that's thematically correct at that ending, and I there's something about that I find so delectable, and I love this world, this remorseless world the movie creates of like, there's this political strife going on, both in the very beginning with like the bombing in Jerusalem, and then I didn't know what it was either, I guess with Nicaragua where we are, but there are these rebels, these armed rebels, and there's some discussion of like the political context going on, like the president has sort of like liberal cred, so he can't like condemn the rebels too harshly, or he can't really come to the old company's aid or whatever. So there's this kind of political context going on, and we're given a sense of like what's going on, but the movie's not really about that. These people are kind of adrift in this chaotic world, and it's incredibly cynical the way the movie frames it, but it's sort of like they're sort of can only help themselves. Is really their only upside here. They can only try to get themselves out of this situation. And all of these characters at some point do something awful or say something awful, or reveal something terrible about themselves. And everyone gets like one moment. But one of the most striking ones is Roy Scheider, who's I guess our de facto protagonist, who after the bridge scene, and I love this, he is so excited that the other truck, who we've seen them kind of bond with at this point, and they've like gone through some stuff together, in a more conventional movie, they would be like starting to become friends. He's so excited they're going to die. He's like, we're going to get 40,000 apiece, 20,000 apiece, 20,000 apiece. And he like keeps saying it, like repeating it to himself. And there's something so like savage and like inhuman about that I love. And I just connect that to that moment, that image of the flames bursting from the earth, like we're in hell. I think that's good. I think that's the good stuff. No matter what Kirk says, that's the good stuff. Okay, guys.
All three of you have made fair, valid points in my mind. I do wish, and I think everyone's touched on, I do wish that kind of the geopolitical side was fleshed out a bit more. For me, I think the best, actually, I do think most well-crafted scene was the bridge, probably the second bridge because it was more expansive, but scene. But I think the best scene of the film, the most affecting scene for me, was when they're bringing the bodies back from the oil field, and the locals are meeting their family and friends who have been burned, to a crisp. And the first truck, they pull out some bodies that are badly maimed and obviously fatal injuries, but the second truck contains these charred remains wrapped in plastic, and the whole crowd just goes quiet, and you can kind of feel that the energy of the crowd as they're kind of digesting this information and this unspeakable travesty that's befallen their village. And then the collective uprising ensues. And I think that's such a great scene. And I really wish they had tapped into that more, especially, later on, there's what appear to be like some freedom fighters who try to hijack one of the trucks. And I think for me, it would have been really cool to have an element there where, as the movie plays, they're unsuspecting, they don't understand that the cargo is dynamite. But for me, it would have been kind of cool for them to realize, oh, you're trying to go blow up the oil field so that you can resume work, and so that, America can keep making money, right? Like, you filthy capitalists can grind our country and sap our natural resources. And so then they blow up the truck in protest or something like, I don't know. But that's not, like Tony said, like Connor, it's not this movie, I guess. So maybe I'm a cake eater. Like I want to have my cake and eat it too, right? And I kind of wanted that element. But I feel like there was such a setup in the beginning. Like, it was such an ambitious setup that I really thought it was going to be more than just kind of like the classic suspense film. And I think like the first 25 minutes were really astounding, like truly great. And so maybe I was a little disheartened to see, and I guess I call it kind of like haphazard or kind of distant, dispersed, dispossessed at the beginning. But, in a way it was ambitious. I appreciated that. And then it felt like it kind of went on rails, right? Like in a video game, right? Like a QTE, we kind of got on rails during the bridge or during the mission itself. And that's okay. And I appreciate that. It's just a different part of my brain that's being used to enjoy that side of it. And so those are basically my thoughts. So I don't know if Anthony has anything else he wanted to add, but yeah.
Well, no, I like that scene you mentioned a lot too, Kirk, but I have a little bit more of a cynical thing, which is than the way Connor sort of presented it, or maybe a cynical approach to the way Connor kind of read the film, which was every person that we're kind of introduced to as a sort of anti-hero protagonist or whatever is a truly kind of symbolic person to show just how cruel outside influence is on this kind of Latin American country or like village, town, whatever you want to call it. We have from the get-go someone from Mexico, we have a US citizen, and then we have someone from Palestine and someone from Paris who's kind of fleeing in. And what they're all there essentially doing is allowing the oil company to continue to flourish for another day. And there's this weird sense that it doesn't matter how doomed the village is first, it's that the oil company will continue. And then it doesn't matter how much these other people have to endure because it's all about oil at the end of the day. And the thing that brings down Roy Schneider's Jackie isn't the oil, it's his problem back home, which I've always thought was an interesting choice. It would be more of a fascinating moment to me if the oil company or the sort of corrupt government killed Jackie in the end, as opposed to the random New Jersey gangster. And this brings me to my point with the rebel fighters, which I thought could have been a much more fascinating moment, because we're here, if we're following the sort of Nicaragua-like setting, we're having almost a parallel to a sort of Sandinista-esque moment. But there's a great tragedy about this, which is that what do the rebels hope to achieve at all? Because the way I see the rebels are, they're so essentially clueless that they can't even take out Jackie and like a wounded man, that they just completely falter and it allows the oil to continue. It's a sort of simple plot moment that I thought kind of was robbed of a sort of more interesting political commentary, political contrivance for the sake of the film. That's kind of a minor point. Maybe, like you said, Kirk, I'm just wanting something from it. That's unfair to say it's not there. But that's just the way I kind of thought about things.
No, I really like it for both of you, what you said about those rebel characters, because I think that would, solve the issue of the incongruous, gangster showing up at the end. I do like what Tony says, and maybe Tony is kind of right. The fact that they feel as if they come out of nowhere. The fact that it's shown explicitly that one of the guys basically betrayed him, that he led them there, which doesn't quite make sense, but it's supposed to feel like kind of a remember this kind of unexpected blast from the past, but in a more negative way, I guess. Blast from the past doesn't quite cut it, but this kind of forgotten, thing that's going to destroy you. But
what I liked it because it's like from his perspective essentially, right? Because it's like this thing of like if you're him and you see them walking in, you're dead in 2 seconds, but your last thought is what is going on, right? Like that, and that feeling of like kind of after everything you've been through, this is the thing. It is kind of analogous to the end of A Serious Man, when he gets the call and he's told, we don't hear it, but he's implied he like has cancer, right? Which is something we're not thinking about at all, but it happens every day. And that's sort of like when you play in this world, when you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And it's like when you are a killer, there's death around every corner. You could die. It's like at the end of The Sopranos. It's like, who is the guy in the jacket, at the bar? It could be anybody. We don't know. It doesn't matter that it's not specifically set up. It literally could be anyone from his life. So on that level, I appreciate it.
But just one final point to complicate that, I think, which is, isn't it interesting that the killer arrives only in the moment when he starts dancing with the villager? It's in like fact of like, despite having the passport, despite having the ID to get out finally, and the money and the nice clothes, like he doesn't look like anyone else in the town really. Despite having all these moments, it's the moment when he starts dancing that Friedkin decides to let the killer finally go in. So I feel like in a sense, Jackie's bonded himself to the town by finally participating in the economy. Like he saved oil for another day, and by saving it, he's doomed himself. Which is why I think it should be a different killer. But I think it's something interesting there about the dance partner, of course, and the timing of things.
No, I truly actually like that. I do think I would prefer that. I guess again, in a point in Tony's favor would be to say that like it's trying to communicate every man has his own personal doom. He has his own personal nemesis or avenger that will come to get him. In this case, I guess why couldn't it be the rebels, right? The rebels get the assassin character, right? Even though that's not necessarily the one who should have killed him, right? Why can't they get Jackie as well? I guess there's no really good reason for that, but I think maybe just to literalize this idea of the nemesis, right? That is also coming, and in this case is the rebels coming for the oil company. of course, kind of implied that eventually, the oil boss will just be able to, go back to the U.S., I'm sure, right? But maybe it's implied that maybe not, right? Maybe there is a real threat, right, from the rebels who are making moves on the oil. But just to one other thing, or just one thread I think you guys picked up on, mentioned kind of lack of dialogue, and Tony also mentioned, the way in which Roy Scheider's character, right, insists that, like, or he says, we can get a double share. They're never going to make it over the bridge. These guys are competing at first, right? And it's every man for himself. It's dog eat dog, et cetera. And that's the world we live in. Notice, though, that anytime, right, that wall seems to drop, like, for instance, right, we have another favorite sequence of mine, the blowing up the tree scene with Kassem, who's our demolitions expert, right, creates this elaborate MacGyver-esque explosive, setup that can blow up this tree that's in the way. And I love that moment. It's so methodical. We get to a point where all of these men are working together. We get to see these men simply working together. They're communicating almost wordlessly. They're not yelling at each other. They're kind of just nodding to each other, showing each other, does this rock work? He doesn't say so much, but then he just throws the rock away. They're communicating through nods and on this kind of fundamentally human level of labor, of simple cooperation. And immediately after that, right, they've succeeded in blowing up the tree. They've avoided kind of jungle madness, which was sort of what was being threatened immediately before that, with Roy Scheider, going crazy with a machete and the assassin about to kill him. And finally, now they're in the trucks again, and both pairs begin to reconnect, right? Begin to connect on a human level after this event. They've just made it through, right? So they seem to be kind of being humanized through this process of shared work and cooperation, where, for instance, Kassem asks the French guy Victor about his wife, right? And as soon as he begins talking about his wife, reminiscing about how it must be 9 o'clock in France. At that point, the truck blows up and kills them both. Then, in the case of the rebels, we have this moment of the rebels, they start to kind of joke around. They don't seem very threatened. They become kind of reassured that neither of these people they've stopped on the road are threats, right? He says, like, the little dove won't come out of his nest or whatever. And they're kind of saying, hey, man, like, we just want some food. Like, it's bullshit, whatever. We just want some food. Come on, man. Just come out of the truck, like, they're not threatened at this point, and they're kind of laughing with each other. And at that exact moment, the assassin character pulls out a gun and shoots the two rebels, and the other one gets, like, hacked apart with a shovel. Basically, at that moment again, right, those moments just communicate, right? They're on the cusp of making a human connection. Tragedy is, right, because of various kinds of self-interest, right, these things break down, right? I guess in the case of the first thing, the truck blowing up, it's not exactly self-interest, but, these human connections are so fragile. They kind of break apart, and often, right, they do have an element of vulnerability. But I think all of the characters, right, seem to have also their doom that kind of awaits them, right? And at any moment, it's hard to know when it's going to come, but it will come, et cetera. Kind of gets back to that idea, right? Even, for instance, think too about, we have two German characters. One is the bartender, right? Implied to be like a Nazi officer, right? Who's tending bar in this Nicaraguan town, right? These kind of outcasts who are very guilty, right? It is this kind of purgatory. Yeah, and also think about the truck, right? Which is called, one of the trucks is called Sorcerer, another truck is called Lazaro, which means, Lazarus, like being raised from the dead, right? This is kind of a place, a kind of purgatory from which they might be raised and might come back to life, so to speak, right? But it never really happens. Anyway, sorry. So I'm just getting all of my thoughts out because I anticipate that we're coming to the end and it's time to vote. Let's not take too long here, guys. Let's just get your pithy opinions. Is this one of the 706 greatest movies of all time? Let's start with Kirk. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I had this realization, and I will try to keep this brief, but I think it's rather important. I thought the assassin character was the guy who was killed in his bed from Veracruz, right? I thought he was the original fourth driver. And the guy who got off the plane with the pencil mustache, I thought he was just this unknown hitman coming for one of the four. And that I thought was so cool because it was like a Letter to Three Wives scenario where it's like, is that for you? Is that for you? Is that for you? And like none of them know like, is it the French banks? Is it the mob in New York? Is it the Israelis? And I thought that's what was going on, but it was actually I got just mixed up. But but even as it is, I don't understand the hitman's motivation for going on this suicide pact trip. Like, why is he doing this? We don't really know. If one of you wants to answer that, that's fine. Either way, I will say I probably historically am a little bit easy on votes. So I really want to vote no. And I think I'll vote yes because I think I will.
Be a great movie, Kurt. You got to think it's great.
Yeah, no, I think I will vote yes because I will come around to this and kind of the imperfections will fade away, right? And I'll be left with a lasting image of some of these very great shots and just this overall conviction of the filmmakers to a premise that is very original and unique. So I will give it a yes.
All right, this is interesting. Not what I was expecting. Now I have to be strategic because I'm curious. If Kirk has voted yes, will someone else vote no, thinking that the movie is safe? Well, we'll see. I wonder who I should go with next. Let's go Tony, because this could be interesting.
I have to concede, first of all, that I feel like this is a movie that I've almost enjoyed discussing more than I have watching it in the moment. I think as I was watching it, I was trying to kind of I was kind of confused by certain things, and I was trying to kind of put it together, and I was trying to kind of see what it was doing, which is partially why I say I want to rewatch it, because I think now that I've seen it and I've kind of know what's going on, I'll be able to just enjoy that first half more, which I did enjoy at the time, but it kind of like, yeah, I don't know. That's the best way I can kind of put it. And I do think there is kind of a structural weirdness to the movie in the way it does take so long getting set up, that it does feel like sort of like, I find it a little bit aesthetically not pleasing. Like, I feel like there could be a little bit, there has to have been a tighter, more economic way of telling the story. There has to have been a more, narratively, thematically watertight articulation of these themes and of this plot. Fundamentally, I don't like that the trucks don't start until after the halfway point. Fundamentally, there's something I don't like about that. But the moments that work in this movie are tremendously powerful. And I do think it has kind of a satanic heart, an evil, depraved, malignant smile that I find bewitching. So I'm going to give it a yes for that reason, because I do think that what Connor has made a very persuasive case for what's kind of going on in this movie. And I do think there is really something about it. Like, just moments like Roy Scheider saying 20,000 apiece, 20,000 apiece, moments like Roy Scheider whacking the trees with a machete, starting to lose his mind a little bit. The image of him falling to his knees before the fire, the image of the guy blowing his brains out in the car, like stuff like that is, as I said, that's the good stuff. Those are the bits of cookie dough and the Ben and Jerry's, my friends. So it's got to be a yes. I'm going to go yes.
Okay, it was interesting. I think if I had picked Tony first, he would have gone yes. But now that Kirk went and he unexpectedly said yes, I thought maybe Tony would change his mind, thinking it was a shoo-in. But I should have known that Anthony is more on the fence probably than Tony is. So, in other words, we'll see how this goes. A little bit less suspense now, but Anthony, let's hear your opinion. I'm curious what you would have said, regardless of the order.
Well, this is kind of interesting because you should never vote this way, I think. But if I had gone first, I might have been inclined to say yes, out of fear of my own misinterpretation or misunderstandings. I'd probably go a soft no, though, now. Maybe I would have done a soft no even then, who's to say. But yeah, I think I like Tony's idea of the destiny, the sort of Sopranos-esque moment of knowing the sort of doom ready to kind of impede and confront you. I didn't necessarily see it, and I didn't necessarily find the moments of the 20,000 apiece the most fascinating parts of the movie for me in particular, which may be why I have certain faults in seeing the power or the dramatic stakes that others have. Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with the assessment I had at the beginning, is that there's a lot of great, interesting moments to discuss. There's a lot of interesting, fascinating things that may probably merit a rewatch at some point, and maybe I'll come around to it more, like Kirk said. But at the end of the day, I still find it a fine movie and not necessarily a great one. And because it's fine, I would have said no, it is not fit for the 706.
I think I understand. Thank you, Anthony. I think I totally understand where you're coming from. And I think upon starting to watch it, and midway watching, I'm like, yeah, this is not a great, but this is a cool movie. Yeah, definitely Tony would like it. I think I've come around to its grand merits and some of it. And again, it took some thinking to get me there, I think, on top of the kind of just functionality of the movie as a fun suspense movie. But again, it was those little moments that did elevate it for me, as Tony mentioned. But I'm a little bit surprised. I thought this was going to be a flop as we first came into this. So I'm happy you guys overall liked it. You had your reservations, you had your issues with it. Overall, we can say it's not the greatest of the greats, but it definitely an interesting movie that's fun to pull out of the archives and revisit. So thank you guys very much. That being said, guys, let's move on to Anthony's favorite segment. This is the suggestion segment where you guys suggest a movie and I get to choose which one we're going to watch for next time. So who went least recently? So Anthony, you get to make the call now. Who should suggest first? Do you want to go first? Who should go? What order should we go in for the recommendations?
I'm going to have Tony go first. I'll go second, and Kirk go third.
Tony, let's hear it.
So it's probably kind of a hard sell. I know for sure two of you have seen it. I don't know whether Anthony has seen it, but I'm pretty sure he has. And the way I always pitch is like, I'll go over my like master list and there'll always be one that's kind of crying out to me. And this is the one that I can't deny at this moment because I was thinking about it more. And I really think this is one of like the movies of the past decade. Like this is one they're going to be watching for a while and one that like just lives in my head. It's Good Time. I did pitch it once, like right after I saw it years ago. And I rewatched it maybe 2 months ago. And I'm like, damn, like this has got it all. I rewatched Uncut Gems the other day because I love that one too. And like, I think Good Time's the better movie. I think there's more memes from Uncut Gems because of Adam Sandler, but I think Good Time is the purer, the more chaotic, the better expression of the softies aesthetic. And there's just something about the movie that like, when I first, it's lived with me ever since I saw it. And I'm dying to do an episode on it. I think it absolutely merits some further discussion more than just, you know, it's a wild movie or it's a crazy movie. I think there's a lot, it's got a lot going on and I would love to do it. So.
All right. Well, Anthony.
All right, Connor, you're a fan of The End of History. It's come up multiple times. You've said it yourself, but I don't think we've understood the end enough. And I think we need to keep going back to the late 90s to understand what exactly is meant by that phrase and how the art portrayed it. So what I'm nominating is from 1997. It's directed by Alejandro Amenabar. It's called Open Your Eyes, starring Penelope Cruz and a Spanish actor named Eduardo Noriega, I think. Very kind of interesting movie. It's kind of remade more famously, and I think Kirk had seen the remake. I don't know if you guys have, but the remake was called Vanilla Sky, which I think did a horrendous job in comparison to the original. The original, I think, is a very interesting movie about Spanish culture at the end of the 90s in Barcelona, about a young man who seemingly has it all when he's suddenly disfigured and thrown into sort of a weird, surrealistic, how do I put this? Surrealism without the unconscious. And whether we delve into it as a sort of narrative of an individual's solipsism or a culture solipsism, I think it's a very fascinating movie, and you don't want to give anything about it away because of the way it likes to play with the viewer. So I'll just leave it there.
Okay. Lock the handle. Kirk, go ahead.
All right. So I'm also going to choose a film from the late 90s. Not quite as philosophical, I'll say that. But I think it might be a film that none of you have seen. Maybe Anthony, maybe Tony. I'm not sure. Maybe Okay. Starring Sharon Stone, Dustin Hoffman, and Samuel L. Jackson, directed by Barry Levinson. It's called Sphere. This film, you might have been a little too young for it to catch your radar. This caught my radar. Late night runs on HBO right before I would watch some other programs for some weird reason. I don't know why. Why I would, be watching HBO late at night as a pubescent teen. But anyways, this film is about the US government or some sort of intelligence agency discovers a spaceship at the bottom of the ocean that has been there for 300 years. And they assemble a crew and they go investigate the spaceship. And it's a true 90s movie, but with an ambitious concept. And there's a lot of really harrowing moments. There's that phobia called thalassophobia, I believe it's called, fear of like open water. But I guess this is more like the depths of the ocean. There's a lot of tie-in with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, of course, literary classic. It's kind of cool how it nods to that. And yeah, it's just an authentic 90s film that is clinically underseen. I don't know if it's underrated, but it's on nobody's radar. So if we did an episode on Sphere, we would totally be cool. And we want to be cool, guys. Remember that.
My God, Sphere. I'm getting like there are like suppressed memories like welling up of I vaguely can see a scene like through the depths of my mind. I can see a scene of discovering a ship underwater. I vaguely remember it. Interesting. The depths that are being plumbed in more ways than one with Kirk's pick. Okay. Now, guys, I would like you to rebut. You have to make a case for your movie. Why does it belong to the 706? You can also knock down someone else's choice. Just make your case for why you think I should pick yours as opposed to anyone else's. And let's go in the order we originally suggested. Let's go Tony first.
All right. If we're just doing movies that Kirk masturbated to when he was 13, that could be a spin-off podcast. That could be fun. It could be interesting. I don't know if it really belongs here, but that's okay.
I'll tell you, it'd be a higher number than 706. I'll tell you that much.
I'm sure. I also think spheres, as far as shapes go, completely overrated. I think cubes far better. I like the nice right angles. Not about it. I am pretty curious because I've never seen this movie. I think I may have heard of it. I know nothing about it. It sounds like it had a pretty good cast. I was like a fairly big budget movie from the late 90s. So it is cool to revisit stuff like that sometimes. I don't know. As for Open Your Thighs, starring Tom Cruise, Stanley Kubrick's last film was basically a porno, and I don't think it belongs anywhere near our list. It sounded interesting. I don't know. I definitely have the most basic choice. I have kind of the film broiest choice, but that's fine. I'm not ashamed of it. I'll own it. I guess to me, the reason I would pitch Good Time is I think one, it fits in pretty comfortably with what we've done before. I think it is a film that merits an episode. I do think also that I think the Safdie brothers are of the current crop of like emergent young new filmmakers. They're like a pretty big deal. Like they're like a pretty significant, like in terms of like people who are new now that only have a few films under their belt that have a really promising future. They're like right up there in terms of possibly being the next, I don't want to say Coen brothers or whatever, because that's easy, but you know what I mean? Like they could potentially become like the greatest of their generation, I think. And I think that it's important to, periodically look at the up and comers and like kind of see what they're all about. And I also think that like it's slightly less obvious than Uncut Gems, which I know I pitched before as well, but I don't know. But I think this is a movie that I want to plant my flag now, call it a modern classic. I want to plant that flag. I think we can be there. So that's my argument.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I will say that I have seen Good Time. I'm interested in your comparison to Uncut Gems. So I think it's totally kind of eclipsed it in the popular conversation. So I like your championing it over Uncut Gems as part of their canon. And I think I'm inclined to agree with you. We'll see. I mean, no one knows what the future holds, but it's interesting to think about kind of canon formation already for directors who are fairly young in their early in their careers. That's fascinating. So how about Anthony? Go ahead. What's your rebuttal?
Well, as to for Tony's film, I haven't seen it. I had very mixed feelings about Uncut Gems, actually. So I'd be curious. Maybe Good Time would be the one I like. But I understand the appeal of them. I understand that there's talent involved, and I could see a version of myself that's really into their work, even as small as it is right now. So that could be an interesting film. As Tony said, though, it is something very familiar and perhaps comfortable to us, which may be a point in its favor or not. So that's up to you, Connor. But as for Kirk's film, it's the type of film I feel like is sitting at a Walmart bin for $4.99, which could be in its favor.
$4.99, 99 cents, man. Well, $4.99. What is that, like the ultra extended director's cut?
I'm at the Walmart.
That's the
Supercenters
Criterion
and-
4K.
Exactly. No, I mean, I don't really know what to say about Kirk's film. It's kind of interesting, like big budget film. I guess they don't really make anymore. Kind of that grand original sci-fi project, which is always super interesting to me. I saw just on a quick Google that it like flopped critically, which actually makes me kind of fascinated by it. Like I'm always fascinated by these like ambitious like disasters. So maybe I'd be into it, but I know nothing about the movie other than what Kirk said. As for mine, it's an intriguing piece. It's all about the fact of why we shouldn't be cool. So that'd be a point against Kirk. I think I could see mixed response. I don't know how to really pitch my film without spoiling it, and I don't want to. All I'll say is it spawned one of the most memeable, catchable lines that you'll see all over film Twitter, which is Penelope Cruz speaking to a man and saying, "I'll see you in another life when we're both cats." And I'll leave it there.
Interesting. Good rebuttal, Anthony. Now, Kirk, time to weigh in. Make your case for Sphere.
Yeah, no, I will say Good Time is excellent. One of my favorites of the last decade. I think it's a truly New York film and experience. I think that it's kind of like, it kind of flies in the face of the projects that Tarantino does that are more LA centric. It's so gritty and it's kind of grinding on you. It really tries to wear you down. And I think that like, if someone were to ask me like, what is it like to live in New York? I would maybe show them Good Time. I'm not even joking. Like I wouldn't show them like Miracle on 34th Street. I would show them something like Good Time. But that being said, I think if you don't like Uncut Gems, you're not going to like Good Time. I'm sorry. So Anthony, I think it might be an exercise of the three of us kind of singing its praises while Anthony's kind of like, sighing along, but maybe not. Who knows? As for Anthony's film, I have seen Vanilla Sky. It's kind of weird that Penelope Cruz stars in both. And I do remember that line from Vanilla Sky. So if she's topless in this film as well, count me in. I mean, that's, something to consider, Connor, of course. I don't think Sharon Stone is topless in Sphere. As for why we should watch Sphere, I think we have an obligation to people who love movies. We have an obligation to show them what is out there, right? We have to dig deep. We're archaeologists, we're anthropologists, right? We're cultural anthropologists in a way. And this is an excellent specimen that just needs some dusting, some carbon dating, we need to clean it up a little bit. We need to contextualize it. We need to present it in the right light. I think it's got elements of Alien, right? Like that Ridley Scott kind of that mutual paranoia, this claustrophobic, but I don't know. Sphere is kind of, it's off the wall. These other two films fall directly in their little categories. Like Anthony's is like the transit pick and Tony's is like the Tony pick, right? And this Sphere is like the wild card, and I think it's really fun to do wild card films that none of us have seen. I will add that, because we don't know what to expect when we're coming in. Like, we kind of know what's going to happen with Good Time. We have an idea of that we're all going to like to an extent, or we're going to, pontificate about the virtues of Anthony's pick. But Sphere, we might all hate it. We might all love it. We might all be apathetic. And I think that's really kind of exciting. So that is my pitch for Sphere.
What Kirk is saying is like a siren song to me. He's saying everything that I kind of want to hear, but I am very afraid of picking Sphere. I don't know anything about it. Anthony just dropped the hints very strategically that it got bad reviews or was poorly critically received. So he's making me afraid. He's making me afraid to pick it. But I am honestly, what Kirk mentioned, guys, let's just admit, right? A great movie is great to watch, of course, but there's nothing like a great movie that no one else knows about. I know that's not a great impulse, but it's simply true, right? In our postmodern life, right? This idea of finding these hidden gems, of digging into those crates, of finding this thing that we can imbue with so much meaning that only we know about, right? This is what the kind of film buff thing is all about in a way. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe it should be more about a canon. And in fact, this podcast is more about a canon, in which case, deciding between Good Time and Open Your Eyes, which I know nothing about. I'm intrigued by Anthony's. And I think Anthony is kind of right about Good Time, that it sort of fits into kind of more of a typical 706 pick, that it has the kind of the doom and gloom and kind of the grittiness and the suspense. It's certainly a Tony movie, and I think we know what sort of movie. I think we basically just had a Tony movie on this episode. I am tempted by what Kirk said about Good Time being a very good New York film, but not being in New York, doesn't mean much to me anymore. So I'm going to eliminate Good Time. I think there's some good cases to be made against it. Now, I guess that just leaves Sphere and Open Your Eyes. And I'm having a really hard time choosing because I'm really afraid. I basically want to pick Sphere, but I think Kirk is like, this is like a test.
No, Connor, I actually thoroughly enjoy this film. This is not an ironic choice. And I will just say we have accomplished something. If these are the two movies we're choosing between for our film podcast, this is a milestone.
Because, guys, I think how long ago was I Origins? Right? We haven't had an I Origins in a while. We haven't had a good thing to shake it up a little bit, stir the pot, create some chaos.
When you're making a chili, are you just going to throw in Pop Rocks for some reason? No, I'm actually in favor of that. But that's
throwing the Pop Rocks in the chili.
Yeah.
I'm still hesitating, but you know what? For the sake of keeping things fresh on the podcast, we're going to go with Sphere.
We'll be back with Sphere, folks. And also a reminder, mark your calendars, coming up in a few episodes. And we promised, and I've gotten plenty of mentions on Twitter, we promised Cloud Atlas for number 75. It was chosen as the second chancer that we were going to watch. So we're going to be watching Cloud Atlas soon enough in a couple episodes. So stay tuned for that. And without further ado, Anthony, take us away.
We'll be having what she's having.